At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The old lady who's paying for everything." I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I've always believed that family celebrations should be moments of joy. My granddaughter Jennifer's wedding was supposed to be one of those perfect days, the kind that warms your heart whenever you remember it. Instead, it became the day I discovered just how my family really saw me. The morning of the wedding, I spent extra time getting ready. At 65, I'm not vain, but I wanted to look my best. I chose a pale blue dress that Robert, my late husband, had always loved, styled my silver hair carefully, and even applied a touch of the perfume he'd given me for our last anniversary, before cancer took him 3 years ago. "You look beautiful, Alice," I told my reflection, imagining Robert saying those words. I could almost hear his voice, feel his presence beside me. The ceremony at St. Mark's Church was lovely. Jennifer looked radiant walking down the aisle, her face glowing with happiness. My son Richard beamed proudly as he escorted her, and even my daughter-in-law Pamela seemed genuinely emotional. For those brief moments, everything felt right. It was at the reception where everything changed. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, making my way to the check-in table where guests were collecting their name tags and table assignments. The young woman at the table smiled as she rifled through the alphabetized cards. "Here you are, Mrs. Edwards," she said cheerfully, handing me my name tag. I glanced down, expecting to see Alice Edwards, grandmother of the bride. Instead, in elegant calligraphy, were the words, "The old lady who will pay for everything, my gal." Hand froze midair. Surely this was a mistake. "Is something wrong?" the young woman asked, noticing my expression. I forced a smile. "There seems to be a mix-up with my name tag." She leaned over to look. Her eyes widened. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me check if there's another one." "It's fine," I said quickly, not wanting to cause a scene at Jennifer's wedding. "I'll speak with my family about it." I pinned the offensive tag to my dress and made my way into the ballroom, my cheeks burning with humiliation. Had Jennifer approved? This? Richard? Pamela? Who thought this was appropriate, let alone funny? Throughout the cocktail hour, I tried to enjoy myself, chatting with other guests who either didn't notice my name tag or were too polite to mention it. Then I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. "Did you see the grandmother's name tag?" someone whispered with a snicker. "Pamela said they thought it would be hilarious," another voice replied. "Apparently, she's their personal ATM." I moved away quickly, my hands shaking. Just then, Richard spotted me and waved me over to a group of well-dressed guests. "Mom!" he called, his voice carrying across the room. "Come meet the Andersons. Dad used to golf with Bill." I approached reluctantly. Bill Anderson looked vaguely familiar. One of Robert's business associates, perhaps. "Mom, this is Bill and Martha Anderson," Richard said, then added with a laugh, "Mom, our walking bank account." Martha Anderson's smile faltered as she glanced at my name tag. Bill looked uncomfortable. "Alice Edwards," I said firmly, extending my hand. "Robert's widow." "Of course," Bill said kindly. "Robert spoke of you often. He was very proud of you." The conversation continued, but I barely heard it. When the Andersons moved on, I pulled Richard aside. "What's the meaning of this?" I asked, pointing to my name tag. Richard laughed. "Oh, Mom, don't be so sensitive. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you're the one with the deep pockets since Dad left you everything." "It's humiliating," I said quietly. "Oh, please," he rolled his eyes. "Lighten up, it's a party." Before I could respond, Pamela appeared, elegant in her mother-of-the-bride dress. "There you are, Alice. Has Richard been introducing you around? We want everyone to know who's responsible for this gorgeous wedding." She winked, and they both laughed. I excused myself and headed for the restroom, needing a moment alone. As I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue, the door opened, and an older gentleman in a well-tailored suit entered, then backed out, apologizing. "Mrs. Edwards? Alice?" he called tentatively from outside. "It's Martin Reynolds, Robert's attorney. Could I have a word?" I composed myself and stepped out. Martin had handled Robert's estate and had always been kind to me. I couldn't help but notice. He gestured vaguely toward my name tag. "And some of the comments," I sighed. "Apparently it's just a joke." Martin's expression darkened. "It's not funny." And Robert would have been furious. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's something you should know. Something Robert insisted I not tell you unless it became necessary." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. "This is a codicil to Robert's will. He added it shortly before he passed." I opened it with trembling fingers and read. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was clear. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me would be disinherited from their share of Robert's fortune, a fortune much larger than even I had realized. I looked up at Martin, stunned. Why wouldn't he tell me this? "He hoped it would never be needed," Martin said quietly. "He wanted them to treat you right because they loved you, not because they feared losing their inheritance." I glanced back toward the ballroom where my family celebrated, unaware that their behavior had just cost them millions. "What do you want to do?" Martin asked. I carefully folded the document and handed it back to him. "Nothing. Not yet. I need to see just how far they'll go." As I returned to the reception, the name tag felt heavier against my chest. But now, instead of shame, I felt something different stirring inside me. A determination to finally see my family for who they truly were. The morning after Jennifer's wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen table, still in my bathrobe, staring at the offensive name tag I'd placed in front of me. The elegant calligraphy mocked me. "The old lady who will pay for everything." I traced the letters with my fingertip, remembering how Robert would have reacted if he'd seen it. His temper was rare but formidable when someone disrespected those he loved. "They've changed," I whispered to the empty room, as if Robert could hear me. Or maybe they were always this way, and we just didn't want to see it. I got up and moved to the living room, drawn to the large family portrait above the fireplace. It was taken 5 years ago, on our 40th anniversary. Robert sat, in the center, still robust despite the early signs of the illness that would later claim him. I stood beside him, my hand on his shoulder. Richard and Pamela flanked us, and Jennifer and her brother Michael, then teenagers, stood in front. We looked happy. We looked like a family. When exactly had things changed? The question haunted me as I made my morning tea. Perhaps it had been gradual, so subtle I hadn't noticed the erosion of respect until it was too late. The first clear memory came just 6 months after Robert's funeral. Richard and Pamela had invited me to dinner, a rare occurrence even then. They'd been unusually attentive, asking about my well-being, reminiscing about Robert. Then, over dessert, they'd broached the real purpose of the evening. "Mom," Richard had said, refilling my wine glass, "Pamela and I have been thinking about remodeling our kitchen. Nothing fancy, just updating the appliances, new countertops, that sort of thing." "That sounds lovely," I'd replied, oblivious to what was coming. "The thing is," Pamela continued smoothly, "with college tuition for the kids and everything else, we're a bit stretched right now." I remembered the pause, the expectant looks. "Are you asking me for money?" "Not asking," Richard had said quickly. "It's just that Dad left you quite comfortable, and we thought maybe you'd want to help out the family." I'd written them a check for $30,000 that evening. Looking back, that had been the beginning. Small requests became larger ones. A kitchen remodel became a full home renovation. Tuition assistance became luxury cars for both Jennifer and Michael when they turned 18. family vacations that I was invited to join and expected to fund. Opened the hallway closet and pulled out a box of financial records. Sitting on the floor like a schoolgirl, I began sorting through bank statements and canceled checks. The evidence of my financial support for Richard and Pamela's lifestyle was overwhelming. Over 3 years, I had given them nearly $250,000. The phone rang, interrupting my tally. It was Pamela. "Alice, are you home? I've been calling your cell phone." I hadn't even noticed my cell phone was still in my evening purse. "Yes, I'm home. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. Richard and I just wanted to thank you for everything yesterday. Wasn't the wedding beautiful?" "Yes, it was lovely," I said carefully. "Jennifer and Mark are so grateful for your generosity. They couldn't have had such a wonderful wedding without you." I closed my eyes, remembering the $45,000 check I'd written for the venue and catering. I was happy to help. "Actually, that's partly why I'm calling," Pamela continued, her voice taking on that syrupy quality I'd come to recognize. "Mark's parents were supposed to pay for the honeymoon, but his father's business has been struggling, and they've had to back out. Jennifer is just devastated." I could hear what was coming next. "We were wondering if you might be able to help. They've got their hearts set on 2 weeks in Bali. Richard and I would contribute, of course, but with everything we spent on the wedding." "Everything they spent?" I had covered almost all of it. "I'll think about it," I said, surprising both of us with my non-committal response. There was a pause. "Oh, well, they need to book soon to get the best rates." "I understand. I'll let you know tomorrow." After hanging up, I returned to my financial archaeology. Robert had always warned me about Richard's relationship with money. "He sees it as the solution to everything," he'd told me once. "But money without values just creates more problems." I hadn't understood then, or perhaps I hadn't wanted to understand. A knock at the door startled me. Through the peephole, I saw Michael, my grandson, shifting nervously on the porch. I quickly gathered up the scattered financial papers and stashed them back in the closet before opening the door. "Grandma," he said, stepping forward to hug me. At 21, he was tall like his grandfather, with the same kind eyes. "Are you okay? I've been texting you." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit tired after yesterday. Come in." He followed me to the kitchen, where I put on the kettle for fresh tea. Michael had always been different from the rest of them, more thoughtful, less fixated on appearances and status. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," he said, sitting at the table. "The name tag, the way everyone was talking, it wasn't right." I felt a lump form in my throat. "You noticed?" "Of course I noticed." "So, did a lot of people." He looked down, embarrassed. "I should have said something." I patted his hand. "It's not your responsibility to correct your parents. But it is my responsibility to stand up for what's right." He looked at me directly. "Dad and Mom, they've changed since Grandpa died. Or maybe I just didn't see it before. All they talk about is money. Your money, specifically." "What do you mean?" Michael hesitated. "Last week I overheard them discussing your house. Dad said something about how it's too big for one person, and how they could help you downsize." The kettle whistled, giving me a moment to absorb this information. As I poured the hot water over the tea bags, I thought about Martin Reynolds and the codicil to Robert's will. I thought about the name, tag, the constant requests for money, and now this apparent plan to move me out of my home. Grandma? Michael's voice brought me back to the present. "Are you sure you're okay?" I set the teapot on the table and sat down across from him. "I'm better than okay, Michael. I think I'm finally seeing things clearly for the first time in years." "What do you mean?" I smiled, making a decision. "Just that it's time for some changes around here." As we sipped our tea, I found myself studying my grandson's face, wondering if he was truly different from his parents, or if the seeds of entitlement were merely dormant waiting for the right conditions to sprout. For the first time since Robert died, I felt a cold clarity replace my grief and loneliness. I wouldn't be making any hasty decisions, but I would be watching and waiting to see who in my family truly deserved the legacy Robert had left. 3 days after the wedding, Richard and Pamela organized a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I deliberated whether to attend, but curiosity won out. I wanted to see if the name tag incident had been an anomaly or part of a pattern. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club dressed in a simple but elegant cream pantsuit that Robert had always said made me look regal. As I entered the private dining room, I noticed several guests from the wedding, including Jennifer and her new husband Mark, Michael, and various relatives and friends. "Mom, over here," Richard called, waving me toward the head table. Pamela, resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, gave me an air kiss. "Alice, you look nice," she said, her tone suggesting mild surprise. "We saved you a seat right here." I settled into the chair, noting that I'd been placed next to Mark's parents, whom I barely knew, rather than near my grandchildren. The brunch proceeded pleasantly enough until Pamela clinked her glass for attention. "We want to thank everyone for coming today and for helping make Jennifer and Mark's wedding so special," she began. "And of course, a special thank you to Grandma Alice, who has been so incredibly generous." All eyes turned to me. "In fact," Pamela continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "we have an exciting announcement. Grandma will be funding Jennifer and Mark's dream honeymoon to Bali." There was a smattering of applause. I sat frozen, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. I'd made no such commitment. "Mom?" Richard prompted when I didn't immediately acknowledge the announcement. I carefully set my cup down. "This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said, keeping my voice level. An awkward silence fell over the table. Jennifer looked confused, then embarrassed. Mark stared at his plate. "Well, we discussed it yesterday," Pamela said with a brittle laugh. "Remember? You said you'd think about it." "Yes, I did say that. And I'm still thinking." Richard leaned over, speaking in a stage whisper clearly meant to be heard. "Mom, don't make a scene. We've already told them they can book the trip." I felt something inside me snap, a thread that had been stretched too far for too long. "Don't recall agreeing to pay for a honeymoon to Bali," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "In fact, I believe Mark's parents were originally planning to cover this expense." Mark's father shifted uncomfortably. "There were some business setbacks," he muttered. "I understand," I said kindly. "These things happen, but I think it's inappropriate to publicly volunteer someone else's money without their agreement. Don't you?" The table fell silent. Pamela's face flushed red. "Perhaps Jennifer and Mark might consider a more modest honeymoon," I suggested. "One, within their means." "Their means?" Pamela hissed. "What about your means? Everyone knows Robert left you more than comfortable." Something in her tone, the entitlement, the resentment, made my decision clear. My financial situation is not up for public discussion, I said firmly. And neither are my spending choices. Richard grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Mom, stop it, you're embarrassing us." I pulled my arm away. "No, Richard, you've embarrassed yourselves." I stood up, smoothing my jacket. "Jennifer, Mark, I wish you both every happiness. I'd be happy to contribute to a reasonable honeymoon, but I'll discuss that with you privately." As I turned to leave, Michael stood up as well. "I'll walk you out, Grandma." In the lobby, away from prying eyes, I finally let my composure slip. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my car keys. "Are you okay to drive?" Michael asked gently. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken." "You should be proud of yourself. That took courage." I looked at my grandson, really looked at him. In that moment, he reminded me so much of Robert, it made my heart ache. "Would you like to come over for dinner tonight?" I asked impulsively. Michael smiled. "I'd like that." Later that evening, as we sat in my kitchen sharing a simple meal of roast chicken, I found myself confiding in Michael about his parents' behavior over the past 3 years. The constant financial demands, the gradual erosion of respect. "I'm not surprised," he said sadly. "I've watched it happening. After Grandpa died, it was like they saw you as, I don't know." "An ATM?" I supplied. He nodded. "And it's getting worse. Last week I overheard them talking about your house again." "What? Did they say?" Michael hesitated. "They were discussing how to convince you to move into Sunrise Acres." "The retirement home?" I was stunned. My house was my sanctuary, filled with memories of the life Robert and I had built together. Dad said it would be better for everyone if you downsized. He mentioned something about the real estate market being hot, and how they could help you maximize your investment. I felt sick. They weren't just after my money. They wanted my home too. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you," I said, deciding to trust him with the truth about Robert's codicil. But before I could continue, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw Richard's car in the driveway. "It's your father," I said. Michael's expression hardened. "You don't have to answer it." But I was done hiding. "No, I think it's time we cleared the air." I opened the door to find Richard standing there, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell was that performance at brunch?" he demanded, pushing past me into the hallway. Then he spotted Michael. "What are you doing here?" "Having dinner with Grandma?" Michael replied calmly. "Something the rest of you might try sometime without asking for money." Richard's face darkened. "Stay out of this, Michael. This is between your mother and me." "No," I said firmly. "If we're going to have this conversation, Michael stays." "I'm tired of the private manipulations, Richard. Let's put everything on the table." And in that moment, looking at my son's angry face and my grandson's protective stance, I knew we had reached the breaking point. There would be no going back. "I've had enough of your attitude, Mom," Richard said, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "First, the scene at the brunch, and now I find you've been poisoning Michael's mind against us." I sat calmly in Robert's old armchair, hands folded in my lap. Michael stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, watching his father with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "No one is poisoning anyone's mind," I replied evenly. "We're simply acknowledging what's been happening in this family since your father died." "And what exactly is that?" Richard demanded. "You and Pamela have been treating Grandma like a bank, not a person," Michael said before I could answer. "The name tag at the wedding, volunteering her to pay for Jennifer's honeymoon without asking first, talking about selling her house behind her back." "You've been spying on us?" Richard's face flushed darker. "I've been paying attention," Michael countered. "Something you might try sometime." Richard turned to me, his expression shifting to the conciliatory tone he always used when he wanted something. "Mom, you're misunderstanding everything. We're just trying to help you manage your finances wisely. You're not getting any younger. And I'm 65, Richard, not 95, I interrupted. "My mind is perfectly sharp, and I'm more than capable of managing my own affairs. But Dad left you so much—" "Stop." I held up my hand. "Robert left me exactly what he intended to leave me. His estate is not a family piggy bank." Richard's false smile vanished. "So what are you saying? You're cutting us off because Pamela made one stupid joke with a name tag?" "I'm saying that from now on, I'll be making my own decisions about my money and my home. If Jennifer and Mark want a honeymoon in Bali, they can save for it like most young couples do. If you and Pamela want a bigger house, you can work for it." Richard stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Then he turned to Michael. "I want to speak to my mother alone." "I'm staying." Michael said firmly. This is family business. Exactly, Michael replied. And I'm family. Something shifted in Richard's expression. A calculation. A reassessment. He'd always been able to manipulate me when we were alone, playing on my emotions, my grief for Robert, my desire to keep the peace. But with Michael present, those tactics wouldn't work. Fine, he snapped, heading for the door. But this isn't over, Mom. Not by a long shot. After he left, Michael let out a long breath. I'm sorry, Grandma. For what, sweetheart? You've done nothing wrong. For not standing up sooner, for letting them treat you this way. I rose and hugged him tightly. You're standing up now. That's what matters. After Michael left, I sat in the quiet of my home, thinking about Robert, about the codicil to his will, about the family we'd raised, together. Had we gone wrong somewhere with Richard? Or had he always had this streak of entitlement that we'd failed to see? More importantly, what was I going to do now? The answer came slowly, taking shape in my mind like a photograph developing. Instead of confronting Richard and Pamela directly with the codicil, which would only make them change their behavior out of fear rather than respect, I would simply let them continue showing their true colors. Meanwhile, I would quietly reclaim my life and my independence. The next morning, I called Martin Reynolds. Alice, he answered warmly. I've been hoping to hear from you. After the wedding. Yes, that's partly why I'm calling. I explained what had happened at the brunch and Richard's visit afterward. I need to understand exactly what Robert left in his will, Martin. Not just the codicil, but everything. There was a pause. Perhaps this would be better discussed in person. Could you come to my office this afternoon? 3 hours later, I sat across from Martin in his well-appointed office as he explained the full extent of Robert's estate. The numbers took my breath away. Robert built several companies over his lifetime, Martin explained, and sold them at just the right moments. His investments were extremely conservative, which means they weathered the economic downturns beautifully. Knew we were comfortable, I said faintly. But this. Robert was a private man when it came to money. He didn't believe in flaunting wealth. Martin smiled. He always said you married him when he had nothing but potential in a beat-up Chevy, so he never wanted you to become one of those women who only care about designer labels and country club memberships. I laughed softly, hearing Robert's voice in those words. That sounds like him. As for the codicil, Martin continued, it's straightforward but powerful. Any descendant who publicly humiliates you forfeits their entire inheritance. The name, tag incident at the wedding would certainly qualify. And the brunch? That too, most likely. But Alice, you don't have to make any decisions right now. The codicil remains in effect for your lifetime. I nodded, thinking, what if I wanted to make some changes of my own? To my will, to how my assets are managed. Martin leaned forward. What did you have in mind? By the time I left Martin's office, I had a plan. No dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums, just a quiet reclaiming of my life and my power. First, I called my old friend Eleanor, whom I hadn't seen much since Robert's death. We arranged to meet for lunch the following day. Then I stopped by the community center and picked up a brochure for their adult education classes. Robert had always encouraged me to pursue my interest in painting. Perhaps it was time. At home, I sat at my computer and began researching small business loans. Michael had mentioned wanting to open a bookstore after college, but was worried about the startup costs. A genuine investment in my grandson's future seemed like a perfect use of some of my resources. When my phone rang and I saw it was Pamela, I let it go to voicemail. The old Alice would have answered immediately, anxious about what emergency or demand might be coming. But that Alice was fading away, replaced by a woman who was finally recognizing her own worth. The voicemail, when I listened to it later, was exactly what I expected. Alice, it's Pamela. Richard told me about your conversation last night. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We've always had your best interests at heart. Richard and I were thinking we should have dinner this weekend to clear the air. Oh, and Jennifer mentioned you'd reconsidered about the honeymoon? They really need to book soon to get the best rates. Call me back. I deleted the message without returning the call. Instead, I opened my checkbook and wrote a modest check as a wedding gift for Jennifer and Mark. Enough for a nice honeymoon. But in New England, perhaps, not Bali. I enclosed it in a card with a warm note wishing them happiness, then sealed the envelope. My silent strategy had begun. No confrontations, no drama, just quiet, firm boundaries. Robert would have approved. 6 months passed in a blur of quiet but significant changes. I enrolled in painting classes at the community center, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time with Michael, who visited regularly. I provided him with seed money for his bookstore business plan, which was coming along beautifully. Meanwhile, Richard and Pamela's attitude toward me oscillated between chilly distance and desperate attempts to reestablish their access to my finances. When the silent treatment failed to yield results, they would suddenly appear with forced smiles and transparent excuses to visit. Each time, they would eventually steer the conversation toward money, a renovation they were planning, Jennifer's desire to buy a house with Mark, their own retirement concerns. Each time I politely declined to engage. "I'm not discussing my finances," became my mantra, delivered with a smile that grew more confident with each repetition. They didn't take the rejection well. Pamela's texts became increasingly hostile, Richard's calls more demanding. But I had found a new strength in my silence, in the boundaries I was finally enforcing. Today was my birthday, my 66th, and despite my protests, Michael had insisted on organizing a small family gathering at my home. "It's time they remember whose house this is," he'd said with a grim determination that reminded me so much of Robert. I spent the morning in my garden, deadheading roses and drawing peace from the simple task. The garden had been another casualty of the past 3 years. I'd neglected it while catering to Richard and Pamela's demands. Now it was coming back to life, much like I was. By mid-afternoon, my home was ready for guests. Michael arrived early. "To help with final preparations. Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, arranging cheese and crackers on a platter. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing my new dress, a bold red I would never have chosen before. Besides, it's just dinner. But we both knew it was more than that. This was the first time in months that the entire family would be together under my roof. Richard and Pamela, Jennifer and Mark, and even a few of Robert's old friends, including Martin Reynolds. The doorbell rang precisely at 5. Richard and Pamela stood on the porch, their smiles so artificial I could almost hear the plastic stretching. "Happy birthday, Mom," Richard said, handing me a bouquet of store-bought flowers. "Alice, you look different," Pamela added, her eyes taking in my new dress, my styled hair, the subtle makeup I'd applied with techniques learned from a class at the community center. "Thank you," I said simply, stepping back to let them enter. Jennifer and Mark arrived moments later, followed by Martin and another couple who had been close friends with Robert and me. I moved through the greetings and small talk with a composure I would have found impossible 6 months ago. As we settled in the dining room, I couldn't help but notice Richard's gaze moving around the house, assessing, calculating. Pamela's eyes kept returning to the new painting hanging on the wall, a landscape I'd created myself. "Did you redecorate, Alice?" she asked, her tone suggesting she found the changes disturbing. "Just a few updates," I replied. "I've been taking painting classes." "Painting classes?" Richard echoed, as if I'd said I was learning to fly spaceships. "Grandma's really talented," Michael said proudly. "She's already sold 2 pieces at the community art fair." "Sold?" Pamela looked genuinely confused. But why would you need to sell paintings? I smiled. It's not about need, Pamela. It's about joy. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table, broken by Mark asking about the bookstore Michael was planning to open. It's coming along great, Michael said. Thanks to Grandma, I've got the business plan finalized and I'm looking at locations. Richard's head snapped up. Thanks to Grandma? What does that mean? Michael met his father's gaze steadily. Grandma's investing in my bookstore. Investing? Richard's voice rose. With what money? My money, I said quietly. But, Richard began, then caught himself, glancing at the other guests. Maybe we should discuss this privately, Mom. There's nothing to discuss, I replied. I'm making my own financial decisions now. Richard's face darkened. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Jennifer interrupted with a story about their honeymoon to Cape Cod, the destination they'd chosen after receiving my modest gift. The conversation shifted, tension temporarily diffused. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Pamela cornered me in the kitchen. Alice, what's going on with you? She demanded in a harsh whisper. First, you refused to help with the honeymoon, then we hear nothing from you for months, and now you're throwing money at Michael's pipe dream? It's not a pipe dream, I replied, calmly. It's a solid business plan. Don't be naive. Bookstores aren't profitable anymore. He's using you. No, Pamela. I'm supporting my grandson's ambition. There's a difference. Her eyes narrowed. Richard and I have been talking. We think it's time you consider moving somewhere more manageable. Sunrise Acres has lovely apartments, and the money from selling this house could help all of us. So there it was. The plan Michael had overheard, now brought into the open. This house isn't for sale, I said firmly. And my living arrangements aren't up for family discussion. Before she could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway. Everything okay in here? Just wonderful, I said, picking up the cake I'd baked that morning. Shall we have dessert? In the living room, Richard cleared his throat as I began cutting the cake. Before we move on, Mom, there's something Pamela and I want to discuss with everyone. My hand stilled on the cake knife. This wasn't part of the evening I had planned. We've been concerned about Mom's decision-making lately, Richard announced to the room. She's making unwise financial choices, isolating herself, and refusing family guidance. A stunned silence fell over the room. We think it's time to consider a power of attorney arrangement, he continued. For her own protection. Martin Reynolds set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. That's a serious step, Richard. Do you have evidence of diminished capacity? She's giving away money to fund a bookstore in the digital age, Richard replied, as if that explained everything. And she's refusing to consider sensible downsizing options. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This moment had been inevitable from the day I'd started saying no. Your mother seems perfectly competent to me, Martin observed. Making decisions you disagree with is not evidence of incapacity. You don't understand, Richard insisted, his voice rising. She's always relied on Dad, and then on me, for financial guidance. Now suddenly she's making these irrational choices. Enough. I set down the cake knife. I am not irrational, incapacitated, or in need of your guidance, Richard. Mom, be reasonable. I've been reasonable for 3 years, I interrupted. I've paid for renovations, vacations, cars, and a wedding. I've allowed you to treat me like a walking checkbook rather than your mother, but that stops now. Richard's face flushed dark red. Is this what you want? He demanded, gesturing around the table. To humiliate us in front of everyone? To make us look like villains? No, Richard, I said quietly. You've managed that all. On your own. You selfish old woman, he hissed, standing up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. After everything we've done for you. Richard! Pamela tugged at his arm, suddenly aware of how this looked to the others. But Richard was beyond caring. You think you can just cut us off? Dad would be ashamed of you. It was at that precise moment that Martin Reynolds cleared his throat and spoke the words that would change everything. "Actually, Richard," he said, "your father anticipated this exact situation." The silence that followed Martin's words was absolute. Richard stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as Martin reached into his jacket and removed a familiar envelope. "Robert added a codicil to his will shortly before he passed," Martin explained to the stunned room. "He was concerned about how Alice might be treated after he was gone." "What kind of codicil?" Pamela demanded, finding her voice first. Martin looked to me, silently asking permission. I nodded. "The codicil states that any descendant who publicly humiliates Alice forfeits their entire inheritance," Martin said, his voice steady. "This includes treating her with disrespect, attempting to control her finances against her wishes, or trying to force her from her home." "That's ridiculous," Richard sputtered. "Dad would never—" "He did," Martin interrupted. "And as executor of his estate, I've been documenting the incidents over the past several months." He turned to me. "Alice, I have to ask, do you want to enforce the codicil?" All eyes turned to me. I looked at Richard and Pamela, their faces now pale with shock and dawning horror. I looked at Jennifer, who seemed confused and embarrassed. Then I looked at Michael, whose expression held nothing but quiet support. "Yes," I said finally. "I do." Richard collapsed back into his chair. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," I replied. The name tag at the wedding, the honeymoon announcement at the brunch, the constant demands for money, and now this attempt to declare me incompetent, all of it stops today. "But our inheritance," Pamela whispered, "is forfeit," Martin confirmed. "All of it?" Jennifer asked, her voice small. Martin nodded. "I'm afraid so. The codicil is quite clear." "This isn't fair," Richard suddenly shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "She tricked us. She let us believe the money was just sitting there, waiting to be used." "No, Richard," I said quietly. "I never promised you anything. You assumed, you took, you demanded, but you never once asked what I needed or wanted." "What about Jennifer and Mark?" Pamela asked desperately. "They haven't done anything wrong." Martin consulted his notes. Jennifer was present at several incidents, but didn't actively participate in the humiliation. However, she also never spoke up to defend Alice. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have said something at the wedding about the name tag." I reached across the table and took her hand. "We all make mistakes, sweetheart. The question is what we learn from them." "So what happens now?" Mark asked, putting his arm around Jennifer. "Now," Martin said, "according to the terms of the codicil, Richard and Pamela's share of Robert's estate is redistributed." "To whom?" Richard demanded. "Half goes to Alice outright," Martin explained. "The other half is divided among descendants, who have shown her proper respect and care." All eyes turned to Michael, who looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I swear, Grandma, I had no idea about any of this." "I know, sweetheart," I assured him. "Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." Richard stood up again, his face contorted with anger. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. I'll contest it in court." "You're welcome to try," Martin said calmly. "But the codicil is legally binding, and we have ample evidence of the conditions being met." "Alice?" Pamela began, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "Surely we can work this out as a family? We never meant—" "Save it, Pamela," I cut in. "It's too late for that." "So that's it?" Richard demanded. "After everything we've done for you, you're just cutting us off?" "No, Richard," I said, standing to face my son directly. "After everything I've done for you, I'm finally standing up for myself. There's a difference." The gathering ended shortly after. Jennifer and Mark left with awkward apologies and promises to call soon. Richard and Pamela stormed out without another word. Martin and the other guests made tactful exits, leaving just Michael and me in the sudden quiet of my home. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping me clear the barely touched dessert plates. "I'm better than okay," I replied, surprised to find it was true. "I feel free." 1 year later, I stood in the doorway of Chapter 1, the bookstore Michael had finally opened in a charming, converted Victorian house downtown. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating shelves of carefully curated books and comfortable reading nooks. A coffee counter staffed by Michael's girlfriend Emma served locally roasted beans and homemade pastries. In the children's section, a mural I had painted covered one wall, a whimsical forest scene with hidden animals and fairy houses for young readers to discover. Twice a week, I led story time for neighborhood children, something I'd never imagined myself doing before. The small apartment upstairs had been renovated as well. Not for me. I still loved my home with its memories of Robert, but for a young writer-in-residence program Michael had established with part of his inheritance. The bell over the door jingled, and Jennifer stepped in, pushing a stroller with her 3-month-old daughter Roberta, named after her grandfather. "Grandma." Jennifer called, spotting me. "I didn't know you'd be here today." "Just dropping off some new bookmarks I painted," I said, bending to admire baby Roberta. "Hello, little one." Over the past year, Jennifer and I had slowly rebuilt our relationship. After the initial shock of the inheritance revelation, she had made genuine efforts to connect with me independently of her parents. Mark had proven to be a steadying influence, encouraging her to form her own opinions rather than echoing her mother's. Richard and Pamela were a different story. After several failed attempts to contest the codicil, they had moved to Florida, where Richard had taken a job with a former business associate. Our communication was limited to terse Christmas cards and occasional updates through Jennifer. "Have you heard from your parents lately?" I asked as Jennifer settled at a small table with the baby. "Mom called last week," she said with a sigh. "Same conversation as always. Complaints about Dad's job, the house they had to settle for, how unfair everything is." "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Jennifer said firmly. "They made their choices. I've made mine." Emma brought over coffee and fresh scones, cooing over the baby before returning to the counter. Michael emerged from the back room with a stack of new arrivals, his face lighting up when he saw us. "Perfect timing," he said, joining us at the table. "I wanted to run something by you both." He explained his idea for expanding the store's community, programs including literacy tutoring for adults and writing workshops for teens. "It would mean reinvesting some of the profits," he added. "But I think it's worth it." "I think it's wonderful," I said, feeling a surge of pride. As they discussed the details, I gazed around the sunlit bookstore, this beautiful space that represented not just Michael's dream, but a new chapter for all of us. In the year since the revelation, I had discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I'd made new friends, developed my painting, even started traveling. Simple weekend trips at first, then 2 weeks in Italy with a senior tour group where I'd met Claude, a widower from Boston with kind eyes and a dry wit who called me every Sunday now. Robert would have approved, I thought. Not just of the bookstore or my newfound independence, but of the boundaries I'd finally established. He had tried to protect me with his codicil, but in the end, I had learned to protect myself. Jennifer's baby let out a happy gurgle, drawing me back to the present. This was my family now. Not perfect, not complete, but real. We were building something new from the ruins of what had been lost, and it was, in its own way, beautiful. "What do you think, Grandma?" Michael asked, pulling me into the conversation. I smiled at my grandson and granddaughter, at the baby who represented our future, at the bookstore that had grown from trust and respect rather than obligation and greed, I think, I said, that this is exactly where we're supposed to be.